By the end of the last episode, I had brought us to the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene epoch, the name given by geologists to the period following the last glacial maximum, that is, the last great ice age, and through to the present day. As the temperature rose, the human population exploded as it had always done during periods of global warming. Warmer weather is healthier, so people live longer. It encourages vegetation growth, so there is more food for animals and humans, which in turn stimulates much bigger families. 16,000 years ago, inland Scotland was still in the grip of the last ice age and uninhabitable. The low sea levels encouraged the growing population of Europe to move northwest across the dry North Sea as far as the outer islands of Scotland, especially Orkney. Dragging their belongings on crude sledges, for the wheel had not yet been invented, they brought with them the new agricultural technology, carried plant seeds, including staples like barley and wheat, and herded their cattle, sheep and domestic animals along with them. 14,500 years ago, with sea level still 70 metres lower than today, the Orkneys were part of mainland Europe and readily accessible on foot to early Paleolithic explorers, who left evidence of their presence in the form of arrowheads, similar in style and age to those found in northern Europe and Scandinavia. By 12,000 years ago, the climate had warmed to temperatures similar to those we experience today. More and more people were attracted to Orkney and the adjacent coastline because of the growing abundance of marine resources. A shrinking land bridge still enabled access on foot between Scotland and the Orkneys, although the Pentland Firth was filling fast as sea level continued to rise. However, the rising sea would also inundate any coastal settlements which may have been established. Once the land bridge was submerged, crossing from Europe via Scotland required the use of rafts or some form of boat. The 3-metre-long Pesch canoe found in 1955 in the Netherlands is dated at 10,000 years before present, so that form of technology certainly existed, while log rafts are probably even older. The Pesch canoe was made from a hollowed-out pine log. A reproduction showed that it was quite seaworthy. Orkney reduced in size as lower ground was claimed by water. Around 8,000 years ago, it had separated into 2 large islands. Tsunami debris dated 8,200 years ago has been found in the soil profile on the Orkney Islands up to 20 metres above the present sea level. The tsunami deposits are related to an event named the Stora Egga slide that has been well documented from wide-ranging geological and paleobotanical work undertaken over the last 30 years. The tsunamis resulted from 2 massive collapses in quick succession of loose debris on the edge of the continental shelf off Norway, possibly triggered by earthquakes. Tsunami is a Japanese word meaning great wave in harbour. They are unlike normal ocean waves, which result from the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun. Tsunamis result from the displacement of a large body of water, causing a pulse of wave energy to radiate out from the source at about the speed of sound. In the deep ocean, they are just a ripple, but near shore the drag of the shallow seafloor causes the wave to pile up to great heights, sometimes over 30 metres, with devastating results. These Stora Egga tsunamis had a catastrophic impact on communities in Scotland and the Orkneys as far as 30 kilometres inland from the then coastline, probably wiping out most of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers camped on or near the coast. The energy was enough to drive the waves around the world, inundate and wipe out settlers on the dry Dogger Bank in the North Sea, as well as the present-day Netherlands and Norway. 2,000 years after the Stora Egga tsunami, the Orkney Islands had recovered and were beginning to resemble the cluster of islands we know today, except the climate was much warmer. From 6,000 years ago, people were settling down permanently in the Orkney Islands, farming the landscape and building permanent structures to house both the dead and the living. Some of them were probably communities who had been in Orkney for many generations. Others were newcomers, bringing new materials, animals and ideas with them. The occupation of the Orkneys by Neolithic tribes lasted from approximately 6,000 to 4,000 years ago. The Orkney group as a whole has nearly 3,000 identified Neolithic sites, which provide an unmatched window into life on the islands at this time. The assemblage of Neolithic structures in Orkney is without parallel in Britain. They illustrate the full spectrum of life in this period. Complex new societies came to the fore that were a radical departure from the earlier temporary dwelling hunter-gatherers. These new societies created monumental structures that we can still examine today. The Orkneys were the starting place for much of the Neolithic culture, including styles of architecture and pottery that developed much later in the more southern parts of Britain. Before I go any further, I'd like to divert a little to expand on my opening statement in the first episode concerning the claim that the science is settled. That claim is a complete myth. Science is not a body of established facts. It is simply a body of more or less persuasive arguments advanced to try and understand or make sense of a group of observations about the world. There is often more than one way of interpreting any body of data. How do we decide which interpretations are reasonable and which are not? Aristotle in 330 BC led the way in proposing the principle, now known as Occam's razor, attributed to the 14th century philosopher William of Ockham. This recommends choosing the hypothesis with the fewest assumptions when selecting between competing interpretations of the same set of data. It is also known as the principle of parsimony. To Occam's razor, we might add that the most likely candidate is the one that survives the most rigorous testing and still fits the data. Even better, if it not only explains the current situation, but can accurately predict what might happen next. In other words, it is predictive. A key component of archaeological discovery is the use of radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon measurements are always reported in terms of years before present, BP. This figure is directly based on the proportion of radiocarbon found in the sample. It is calculated on the assumption that the atmospheric radiocarbon concentration has always been the same as it was in 1950, and that the half-life of radiocarbon is 5,568 years. Both these assumptions are now thought to be wrong. Consequently, modern radiocarbon dates are calibrated using a computer program based on thousands and thousands of tree ring dates compared to radiocarbon dates on each tree ring. This is an example of the calibration of a radiocarbon date of 3,000 plus or minus 30 years BP. The results of calibration are often given as an age range. In this case, we might say that we could be 95% sure that the sample comes from between 1,375 calibrated BC and 1,129 calibrated BC. Thus, in 2024, we might say the samples date from 3,400 to 3,150 years ago. This is my own version of a calibration curve. In the case of the previous example of 3,000 years BP radiocarbon date, this corrects to 3,275 years ago in 2024, which is the midpoint of the range in the previous example. For the purposes of this talk, I would round this up to 3,300 and report it to you as about 3,300 years ago. This is how I'll report dates from now on. Now that I've got that out of the way, I'll turn to a few of the most significant of the numerous important Neolithic sites in the Orkney Islands, starting with the Knap of Howar. One of the best websites for exploring the Neolithic in Orkney is this one, maintained by a team at the University of York. The team also includes Dr. Hugo Anderson Whymark, curator of prehistory at the National Museum Scotland in Edinburgh. Dr. Anderson Whymark has produced over 160 three-dimensional images of Neolithic settlements and artefacts in Orkney, which provides a marvellous insight into that period. I shall be drawing on some of his work in this series and acknowledge his genius and ownership of the copyright to his imagery. Knap of Howar Neolithic farmstead is probably the oldest preserved house in northern Europe. Situated on the island of Papa Westray, which may have been combined with nearby Westray in the early Neolithic, the farmstead consists of two adjacent rounded, rectangular, thick-walled buildings with low doorways linked by a passageway. This structure was inhabited for 500 years from 5,300 years ago, but was evidently built on the site of an even older settlement dating from 5,600 years ago. In the late 1920s, Gordon Child's excavations at Skara Brae on mainland Orkney captured the imagination of people across the Orkneys and spearheaded a new era of archaeological fieldwork in the islands. William Trail, the Laird of Papa Westray and Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, was one of those inspired by Child's excavations. The Trail family had owned Papa Westray since 1637. His ancestor Thomas Trail had built Holland House in 1810, situated only 600 metres from some prominent knolls on the coast, which the Vikings had named Howar, the plural of Howar meaning mound. The locals somewhat redundantly added the Gaelic word knap, meaning cap, so the mounds became known as the Knap of Howar. In 1929, William Trail began investigating the Knap with William Kirkness, an amateur archaeologist, and like Trail, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. They chose the site because it was handy to Trail's farmhouse, and midden material with some stonework had been seen eroding from the Knap on the cliff edge. Kirkness was a keen photographer, so the excavation was thoroughly documented in photographs and meticulous records. Not only that, but in 1923 Kodak had released the world's first 16mm movie camera, and Kirkness had acquired one. He produced a 9-minute film of their work, which was included with their presentation of a report to the Society of Antiquaries Scotland. The report was published in the Proceedings of the Society in March 1937, and the film is available for viewing on the Moving Image Archive of the National Library of Scotland. Before starting their work, Trail and Kirkness travelled to Skara Brae to see how Gordon Child had conducted his investigation. Kirkness documented this visit on film. It gave them a good insight into what they could expect to find hidden under the hillock. Back at the Knap of Howar, Trail and Kirkness, with the help of some farm labourers, began to remove the 3-metre thick mound of wind-blown sand that covered the site. They disposed of the sand by simply throwing it over the cliff. Underneath the sand, Trail and Kirkness exposed 2 houses, side by side, constructed of dry-built stone slabs with surviving walls up to 1.6 metres high. The buildings had been erected on a pre-existing midden and were surrounded by a contemporaneous midden. Entry to each house was by a stone-covered passageway, only 1.4 metres high, but 1.8 metres long and 60 centimetres wide. Stone slabs on the inner end of the passageway to the southern larger house formed the frame for a door, which must have been of only very light weight, because the openings for the bars that kept the door shut are only very small. This house was divided into 2 chambers by stone slabs and timber posts, though no trace of timber remains in the post holes, which are 12 centimetres in diameter. The side slabs of the dividers were bonded into the walls, which stood about 1.5 metres high, while the middle slabs were about half that height. A recess about 60 centimetres wide and 30 centimetres high was set into the north wall of the inner chamber. Opposite the recess, Trail and Kirkness found a saddle cairn and 2 grinders surrounded by piles of ground mollusk shells. Kirkness filmed a young lassie demonstrating the use of the cairn. A low platform ran along the entire side of the south wall of the outer chamber, which was paved. It had been divided by thin stone slabs. Trail and Kirkness interpreted this area as a bedchamber. A passageway connected to the smaller building on the north side. This building was partitioned into 3 compartments by 2 parallel rows of stone slabs. The innermost compartment was further divided into a series of cubicles by stone slabs. Along the whole south wall of this compartment was a series of cupboards, each about 30 centimetres high, that were probably used for storage. Set into the floor were 2 fire pits, both of which contained the bones of a young ox and a young sheep, together with a hammerstone. The middle compartment also contained recesses in the wall, as well as a partition demarcated by stone slabs. In addition, there were 2 stone hearths, still containing ash of indeterminate origin. Trail and Kirkness recovered a wide range of artefacts, which they interpreted as belonging to the Iron Age. They included fragments of pottery, a large number of animal and whale bones, some of which had been fashioned into implements like hair pins and fish hooks, as well as stone axe heads and flint tools. These stone tools, like the material used to construct the houses, were all sourced locally from the Upper Stromness flagstone, a geological unit within the Cretaceous Old Red Sandstone, which underlies most of the Orkney Islands. The rocks are rhythmically bedded, predominantly fine-grained flagstones, which weather to a grey colour due to the carbonate content being dominantly calcite. They form a thin sliver along the coast at the Knap of Howar in fault contact with the Middle Russi flagstones, which are almost identical, except the carbonate is dolomite, which weathers to a reddish colour. These lime-rich beds commonly contain abundant fish fossils, for which the Orkney Islands are renowned. The finer sandstones were fashioned by the Neolithic craftsmen into tools like this one. Trail and Kirkness called these spindle-like stones. They look a bit too blunt to be used for boring holes into deer antlers or bone, as some claim. Calcareous sandstone also is pretty soft. Maybe Trail and Kirkness were right, and they were spindles, perhaps for pottery wheels. In my opinion, they were used to hammer limpets and other shellfish off the rocks. This bone awl was a more likely candidate for boring holes. They recovered a lot of cobbles that had been fashioned into grinding stones for use with the cairns. Here's a spatula made out of animal bone. This whalebone mace head was possibly used as a hammer or a mallet. Stone axe blades, as well as flint microliths, were probably used in leather working. The Trail and Kirkness Hall also included some fragments of pottery, now recognised as Unstonware, after the items found in the 5,600-year-old Unston chambered cairn, located about 3 kilometres northeast of Stromness. Unstonware is distinctive in both its decoration and the rounded base on the bowls, which differ from the younger grooved ware found at Skara Brae. Trail and Kirkness donated all their finds to the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland in Edinburgh, which had been started by the Society of Antiquarians in 1851. The museum was amalgamated with the Royal Scottish Museum in 1985 to form the present National Museum of Scotland. William Trail was concerned that the site would suffer further from the inroads of the sea and lobbied hard for it to be protected by the government. The site was reluctantly accepted into guardianship by the Office of Works in 1937, but its remote location led to little interest being taken. It took 36 years before the Department of Environment at last took action. Archaeologist Dr. Anna Ritchie was commissioned to examine the site and recommend protection measures, as well as obtain dating evidence. I was intrigued to see this photo of Dr. Ritchie using a plane table for her survey work, a technique which I had been taught in the early 1960s and later used to map out the enormous iron ore deposits in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, which are now Australia's biggest export earner. The illustrious navigator James Cook was taught how to use a plane table in 1758 by Captain Samuel Holland, a British Army engineer. Cook used it to map the dangerous shoals of the St. Lawrence River at Montreal, which assisted General Wolfe to attack from the river and take the city from the French in 1759. So it is a venerable technique with a multiple of uses, although it was superseded this century by the use of GPS. In 1973 and 1975, the site was scientifically re-excavated by Dr. Ritchie. She recovered 98 fragments of pottery, 98 implements fashioned from bone, 27 stone tools and implements, 6 stone knives, 2 querns, and 2 kilograms of flint and chert artefacts. 10 samples of animal bones were submitted for radiocarbon analysis, returning dates ranging from 4,800 to 5,600 years before present, that is 2024. Of course, these dates may be subject to revision. This circular seed grinder has the lower surface ground flat and a convex upper face bearing a pair of hammered indentations. The flat lower surface has a central pitted hollow, the purpose of which was to catch the edge of flat seeds and turn them over to facilitate the grinding of wild seeds, suggesting gathering was still employed as well as farming of cereals. Analysis of cereal residue found in some Neolithic pots indicates that the brewing of ale from malted barley was common. Pollen residues from various herbs show that herbs were used to help preserve and flavour the ale. Various fish remains were found by Dr. Ritchie, who postulated that young cod, ballon wrasse, and rockling or saithe were probably caught from shore, while larger cod, ling, and other deep water fish would have needed line or net fishing from boats. This creates a bit of a dilemma. Fisheries research shows that adult cod today prefer offshore banks in water depths of between 10 and 50 metres. There is no reason to suggest that there was any difference in the Neolithic. Mature saithe prefer offshore locations with water depths between 20 and 100 metres, while ling favour depths between 100 and 200 metres. The fish bones at the Knap of Howar indicate fish up to 1 metre long and weighing more than 10 kilograms, similar to those being caught offshore Westray today, were being caught by these Neolithic fishermen. This means they must have had boats capable of withstanding the weather between 2 and 10 kilometres out to sea, and the use of fishing lines capable of holding fish of 10 kilograms, possibly even up to 20 kilograms. The absence of large trees on Papa Westray means that dugout canoes and log boats were highly unlikely. The most plausible craft would be a timber-framed boat covered with hide. The wood could have been driftwood or branches from the scrub that covered the island, as shown by pollen studies. The performance of skin boats is well attested. They are light and seaworthy, as illustrated by the Irish using curraghs to reach Iceland. The Knap of Howar fishermen must also have been capable of making fishing lines at least 200 metres long to fish in 100-metre depths, and strong enough to haul in a 20-kilogram ling. The bait was probably shellfish. Dr. Ritchie found a diverse range of shellfish as part of the diet of the Neolithic occupants. Over 85% of the 76,000 complete shells recorded were limpets, but oysters, winkles and cockles were also significant. As well as being bait for fishing, shells were also crushed to use as a strengthening filler in the pottery clay. Bird relics were also found in the surrounding midden, and although not an important item in the diet, Dr. Ritchie believed that the oil obtained from rendering birds like puffin and great auk would have been invaluable for providing oil for use in lamps. The great auk is now extinct, the last survivor having been killed in 1813 on Papa Westray. Based on the work of Dr. Ritchie, the current consensus is that a timber-framed dwelling was constructed 5,600 years ago and occupied for 300 years. The building was about 400 metres in from the shoreline at that time, with a sandy beach backed by coastal sand dunes in between the house and the shore. Over the next 300 years, and given the very shallow shelving beach and coastline, the sea level rise of about 1 to 1.5 metres would have brought the sea very close to the boundary cliffs. Storm waves would have exposed the flagstone bedrocks. Perhaps due to the dwindling supply of timber, the deterioration of the existing house, and the now ready availability of suitable building stone, the timber structure was demolished and the surrounding midden flattened to provide the foundation for 2 new stone houses, which were first occupied 5,300 years ago. Some of the earlier midden was used to pack between the double stone walls of the buildings to provide insulation. The roof was supported by timber posts and the internal upright stonework. The roof may have been covered with thatch or turf with a central hole to allow smoke to escape, though it is possible animal skins may have been used instead, given that temperatures were warmer than present and a lightweight roof may have been adequate. Cattle and sheep appear to have been reared in equal proportions, the cattle being huge aurochs which stood over 180 centimetres tall at the shoulder. The sheep were a primitive form, bearing poor wool but used for food, as were pigs. Most domesticated animals were killed while young, and as well as a source of meat, provided skins for leather and bone for tools. There is little evidence of hunting for deer, for example, while the seal and whalebone were probably derived from bodies washed up on the beach. Some archaeologists claim that the Knap of Howar was a self-supporting farming unit that had little to no contact at all with other communities in the Orkney Islands. I just don't buy that, particularly the bit about no contact. If you say that on average one generation is about 20 years, and in the Neolithic it was probably more like 15, then at least 5 generations per 100 years, and over the 800-year lifespan of the family unit at the Knap of Howar, that's 40 generations of inbreeding. Inbreeding preserves recessive genes, leading to increasing susceptibility to disease, to mental health problems, infertility, and premature mortality. These can occur as early as 1 generation, let alone over the 40 generations of presumed inbreeding at the Knap of Howar. Dr. Ritchie investigated the most northern of the 3 chambered cairns on the home of Papa Westray. She thought it was the most likely candidate to have been the Knap of Howar's family mausoleum. There is considerable evidence that these sites were gathering places for rituals, celebration, and feasting. Personally, I'm certain that the inhabitants of Papa Westray had regular interaction with other communities on Westray, where other chambered cairns have been found, and given their undoubted sailing skills, with those on other islands in the Orkneys. I like to envisage the chambered cairns as being like churches, where the rituals associated with birth, marriage and death are celebrated, and one of the places where young people can meet and form relationships. Dr. Hugo Anderson Whymark has captured the essence of the southern chambered cairn in this 3D image, which shows how similar it is to the layout of a medieval cathedral with many side chapels, although missing the transept. The interactions in such places would have helped maintain the necessary diversity in the gene pool for these small communities not only to remain viable, but to thrive. The midden at Knap of Howar has been shown by trenching and exposures along the current shoreline to extend over 500 square metres. If circular, This would mean over a radius of 80 metres. It is entirely possible that the settlement was more extensive than just the two known houses. No further systematic or significant archaeological work has been done at the Knap of Howar since 1973, which is a shame because the technological tools available to archaeologists have increased substantially since then. When I was a student geologist in the Snowy Mountains hydroelectric scheme in 1961, we used seismic surveying to determine the ground conditions at various proposed dam sites. Using explosives to generate the pulses for seismic detection is probably too brutal for archaeology, but alternatives such as using a hammer on a steel plate are more than adequate to provide shallow, three-dimensional information. I note that marine seismic has been used by archaeologists to examine the shallow depths of the Bay of Firth, leading to the discovery of 5 sites now underwater, including a stone pier. Another useful non-destructive technique is ground-penetrating radar, used, for example, by police forces to detect buried bodies under or in thick concrete slabs. Under the right conditions, for example, uniform sand dunes or sandy soil, it has proven to be a very effective tool in archaeology. Other geophysical techniques, including magnetics and induced polarization, are probably more appropriate for Bronze and Iron Age sites containing metalliferous material, but could also provide some indirect evidence. Preliminary electromagnetic surveying has been tested on the Loch of Stenness. Results are very promising. For example, a submerged anomaly that looks very much like a possible chambered cairn was found northwest of the Unston chambered cairn. In the course of preparing this video, I've become rather fond of the family at the Knap of Howar. I think they deserve to be revisited by experts equipped with the latest technology to expand our knowledge of this remarkable place. In the next video, I'll look at Skara Brae, which age dating suggests might be contemporaneous with the last stages of occupation of the Knap of Howar. This was a place where canny Scots engineers installed a reticulated water supply to every house and flush toilets, thousands of years before the Minoans and then the Romans followed suit.